I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati. Our esteemed guest today is Realtor, author, Bad Mama Jamma, Towne. Dawn, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm excited to have a conversation. So you're writing a book. It's going to be coming out here. We actually met through Rory Vaden, who is episode 100 of this podcast. Rory's a good friend of mine. Rory was my personal coach for over 10 years. And we met on a Zoom conference that was supposed to be in person called through Brand Builders Group called Phase 1. And we were working on implementing our brand DNA and doing some different things. And so through that process, I found out that you're in the process of writing a book and launching that. Hashtag more than done. And I love the byline or the subtitle of living now as the woman you aspire to be. I think it's really interesting that in this, as we're filming this, as we're recording this in our COVID-19, kind of post-COVID-19 economy, we also have a lot of things going on with, racial injustice. There's a big conversation about equality, both women, and there was the Me Too movement prior to Black Lives Matter. I think that the real estate industry has always done a very good job of being equal. Now, it may not have been that way 30, 40 years ago, but I find it interesting that out of 1.4 million realtors, 67% of all realtors are female, and close to 10 million businesses are owned by women. So why, Dawn, as a realtor from Iowa with RE/MAX Real Estate Specialist, why do you choose to communicate to women in your book?
I would say, I've kind of always had a heart for, having a message driven towards women. And, the name of my book is hashtag more than done. And I kind of had my own more than done moment, which preceded, writing this book. And I think, as you mentioned, we've come a long way. I tend to be someone that likes to look more on the positive side of things. And I just think of how far we've come in our country to have the equality that we have. I know obviously there's still some things that we're working through, but just to see how far we've come and how women have more and more been put into positions of influence, I think that's a really positive thing. And so my heart for women in this, as they have broken through so many barriers, is to be able to really continue to operate from that place of strength and breakthrough that they've come through so far. And so that's a lot about what I talk about in my book is not being held back by old mindsets and limiting beliefs that have held you back previously, but really living now as the woman you aspire to be and operating and making decisions from a place of confidence and expectancy and other things that I address in the book.
I just love that message. And I shared with you as we were preparing, I'll share it with our audience, that our average audience, if you will, or kind of like the subset of an avatar for our audience, is what I like to call Calibrate Callie. And she is 30 to 35 years old. She's a top producer. She may have been nationally recognized for her real estate professionalism as well as her production. She's probably a mom. She probably has a spouse. Although I know some Calibrate Callies that are divorced now, and she's a working mom with a couple of kiddos and battling with this issue of identity where she's a boss lady. She is absolutely in charge of things in the workplace, and at sometimes in the home front struggles with the fact that maybe her spouse might fall into some of our older, maybe 1950s era things that people think about, where she's still focused on making sure that the kids get to school, making sure that their backpacks are packed, making sure that the breakfast or dinner is made, and juggling all of this. And I think that a lot of evolved spouses, of course, are helping. But when you speak to that woman, and I really enjoy that you've described this to me, and I'll let you share it, of how you ask for your audience, that Calibrate Callie who's reading your book, to change her name. What does that mean to change someone's name, and what's the exercise you lead your readers through in the book?
So the concept in the book where I change your name begins with a letter that I write to my reader. So for instance, the very first page of the book is Dear Fearful. And as I dive into describing the fearful woman, I address some of those issues, how we sometimes are paralyzed by operating out of a place of fear. And then throughout the course of the letter, I encourage you to change your name to Fearless, and then what that looks like. And through the process of the book, I flesh out that concept of how you change your name. And so one of the main pieces of the book is how to dismantle an old mindset. And sometimes how you do that is you take it apart. When you take it apart, you take the power from it. And then I encourage you to take on a new mantle. So in the fearful case, the new mantle is being fearless. And so I encourage my readers to do three things: dismantle the limiting belief, which is fear, and then envision themselves as the woman they want to be and the woman that they aspire to be. So I ask lots of reflective questions that help them to dive deep into that. Even questions that are simple as, what does the fearless woman look like? Who does she speak to? What content does she consume? Who does she surround herself with? What is her thought life like? I ask all of these detailed questions because I feel like when you're trying to move from a limiting belief into something new, a new chapter, a new territory, a new transition, that helps to put flesh and bones on that woman that you aspire to be, and start, in a sense, like break down the pedestal. Sometimes we look at who we want to be as far off or far out of reach, and we struggle with closing the gap from who we want to become and who we are right now. And my process is, we need to work on closing that gap, and it's not as impossible as it seems. You get there by dismantling, by envisioning yourself as the one you aspire to be, and then speaking that out. Another key thing is speaking life over yourself, speaking from that place of fearlessness versus fearfulness. And the different issues that I address in the book, or the names that I address in the book, I talk a lot about the power of your words, and how important not just your thoughts are, but your words are, and how they need to come into alignment. Because I think we hear a lot about our thought life and maintaining, having a growth mindset, and all of that is really good, but you really want to pair that with the words that you're speaking out. You don't want there to be a contradiction, because then there's kind of a breakdown in what you're really trying to accomplish if you have that growth mindset, but yet you're still speaking from a place of being fearful. And so these three things of dismantling and envisioning and speaking out is kind of my process for how you change your name from being fearful to being fearless, from being regretful to walking as a woman who is full of wisdom. And a lot of this leads back to perspective, because when you're living life from a place of fearfulness and fearlessness, sometimes the big aha moment is just when you shift perspective. And so that's what I try to accomplish in the book, is just helping people shift perspective. So for instance, when I talk about regret, you can look at regret as a bad thing if you want to, or you can look at all the things that you've done in your life that maybe you quote unquote regret as realizing that now you have so much wisdom to offer. You can look at it as regretful, or you can just say, I have so much wisdom from those things that I've experienced in my life that maybe I regret. And that just helps to open your eyes just to a new way of thinking about things, and walking from a place of wisdom and making decisions from a place of wisdom is just so much healthier than living and making decisions from a place of regret. So that's kind of really the heart behind the process of the book.
I just love all that, because as a male and as a husband and a father, I have those feelings myself, and it's not unique to just females. Now, I also have shared openly on our podcast that my wife, Courtney, we and I joke, we joke together, she and I joke together, that she sometimes thinks a little bit more like a guy, because she's more pragmatic, more logical, more linear thinker. And kind of the stereotype is that may be more like a guy thinker, or maybe the engineer personality. I'm very expressive. I'm kind of the aesthetic. I am, I have a lot of feelings. Those feelings are on my sleeve at all times. And so I very much, even though this is written for a female, I very much associate with the things that you're sharing. I have those same thoughts and issues, even though I've succeeded. And I also have a daughter that's very much like me, that I can see this book speaking to her very much. So we were chatting at the beginning of our interview, Dawn, that as realtors, one of the things that happens in our industry is 1.4 million realtors, and that's a trade organization. You can be a licensed real estate agent without being a realtor, but the National Association of Realtors tracks us at about 1.4 million, and then 67%, almost 70% of the realtors are female, which I think is amazing. And the majority of women realtors are in their 50s. I mean, that's the average of that. And so I think it's really interesting that you've got all these women doing great real estate sales and really helping grow our economy, help people find the house that they love or commercial real estate that they love. And then you've got all these business owners, over 10 million businesses that the U.S. Department of Labor has surveyed as being women-owned businesses, accounting for 1.4 trillion in receipts, yet only 27% of chief executives are women. And I feel that that's a real big disparity in corporate America. And as a real estate agent, as a female, how do you feel about that? And why do you think that, the real estate industry is so progressive, small business is so progressive, but yet, maybe corporate America hasn't quite gotten there yet?
That's a really good question. How I feel about that, I would say, again, I like to look at things from a positive perspective and how far we've come, and yet also looking at how far we have to go. So I would say part of that is, continuing. The conversation that was going around, when I was in my early 20s is very different even than the conversation that goes on around now. The personal development field has evolved over, the course of, even 10 years, 15 years. And so just to see that as more information becomes available to women and in general on how to succeed, how to move forward, how to really break through into industries that maybe were initially more male dominated, I think we're going to see a continued growth in that area as women learn that they have a voice in the conversation, they belong at the table too, and that their voice counts and their voice matters. I feel like we're going to see that continue to grow and develop and evolve. And I think the fact that the growth that we've seen is encouraging. But like I said, I think as our cultural conversation continues to evolve, we'll see those numbers rise. And so I guess I come from a place of really feeling encouraged about that and trusting that, as we've seen so much, even in the last months, more and more conversations are being surrounded by, groups that maybe didn't have a voice before, and we're seeing them have that ability to have that voice more fully. So I truly believe that we're going to continue to see that evolve for women as well in the corporate workplace, as we open the space for more conversation.
It's really encouraging that currently in the middle of the summer in 2020, that we're having this new movement, which is really a reboot of a movement that happened in the 60s and has needed to happen for a long time with equality. And it can go across race, it can go across gender. I have to ask a difficult question, and this is a white male in the United States asking you a question as a female. Do you feel like you've ever been discriminated upon, or do you ever feel like you've been judged or mansplained, or however you want to call it? Do you feel like that's ever something that's happened to you, and that you have been passed up on opportunities and missed out on opportunities because you're female?
That's a good question. I would say, there's not exactly one specific instance that comes to mind with that. Has that happened in my life? It could have been a precursor for a decision that maybe I wasn't even aware of that was happening behind the scenes. But I would say, as we, continue to evolve as a country, I really feel like my hope, of course, is that those issues that that people generations before have had, those battles that they have had to fight, for women's rights, that, we're reaping the benefits of that. And hopefully, as we continue to fight forward, our daughters will reap the benefits of the battles that we fight for them. And so although I don't have a specific instance that comes to mind for that, I look at it from the perspective of anything that comes at me as a challenge is an opportunity for me to move forward and break through and power through regardless of what somebody else thinks or does, or barriers that they try to put in place. I'm always looking for solutions. So, I'm sure it could have been something that has played a role at some point that maybe I wasn't even aware of, but I just like to think of solutions and moving forward. And I definitely see a pattern of that moving forward.
Well, and let's maybe pivot the question just slightly, but kind of along the same lines as a male, I don't often get super scared in a vacant property. I don't think a whole lot about showing a vacant apartment building or commercial property or even a vacant house. I really don't get bothered by meeting people for the first time at a property and touring them through it. I don't, when it gets a little bit dark outside, I'm not looking around the corner with my keys in my hand, worried about what my safety plan is going to be. And I know from having a wife and from having sisters, I've got 3 sisters, and having daughters, that those are real things that they think about constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is that like? Because I think it's important to have someone like myself say, how can we change this as men that care a lot about the females in our lives? How can we change some of the ways that you're feeling, some of the insecurity you might feel just because of safety issues, or really that you don't feel like maybe you have a seat at the table if it's that corporate boardroom? How can I facilitate that discussion of change?
That's a good question. I do completely relate when you put it in perspective of that, of, my escape plan and having, needing to keep things in my car that maybe I take with me for self-defense and things like that in case that situation were to ever arise. So that definitely is a very real fear for a woman, when she's showing a vacant property, or, I guess we're taught to always have our guard up, because the moment you let your guard down, you could be vulnerable. And so, part of that comes through education, but what I think could be done to improve the comfort level for women as they are, going about their daily life, just in the function of as a real estate agent, is basically holding yourself to a higher standard, or starting that conversation where men hold themselves to a higher standard, in the sense of where, a woman would not have to be in fear for her safety as she's showing, a property on her own and all of that. So I guess what I would encourage in that regard is just encouraging other men for the conversation to really be surrounding themselves on holding themselves to a higher standard. I know I keep repeating that, but that's really just what comes to mind, is really raising that standard so that it's not something that, our daughters will have to worry about as they grow up.
And maybe just even addressing that it's a concern that you already have. And I think that's part of it. As guys, sometimes we might walk through life kind of unaware, or, without this thought process that these are the issues that you're facing, and really address those, especially as an owner of a real estate brokerage firm. We've got ladies that work here that have different thoughts and concerns. And if there's someone kind of shady around our office building, or if there's someone at a property that doesn't make people feel safe, I can ask that question, but also not assume that they are concerned about it. And I think that's part of it, is just to make sure that there's a level of comfort there, and that they feel that someone might have the thought process that they're already naturally having. I think that's really important. I would imagine that to write a book, you've had a lot of people around you, and I'm just so excited to read it. I'm excited to hold the book. #MoreThanDone. That's going to be so awesome here coming up in the next month or two. I have to ask you about Brand Builders Group. I've known Rory and AJ for over a decade. Rory was my personal coach. I met AJ at the same time back in December of 2009. And they were at a former company at that time. And they are doing great things with helping people really grow and monetize a personal brand. And if you haven't listened to episode 100 of our podcast with Rory Vaden, that was a special episode. But Dawn, what has it been like working with Rory and AJ and some of the others at Brand Builders Group?
I would say it has been such a godsend, because before Brand Builders Group, I'm the type of person where I was ambitious, and I gathered so much information. I was like a research, just in research mode, just constantly absorbing information and listening to all of the videos and podcasts that I could possibly listen to about how to develop your brand and grow your audience and market, and all these things that are part of being a small business owner. And at the same time, I had all of this plethora of information, but I struggled to walk it out. I struggled to execute it. I struggled to really gain some traction in moving forward. And so for me, what Brand Builders has done for me is started to bridge that gap and create space for me to actually walk it out effectively. I feel like, I was spinning my wheels in so many ways before brand builders. And then after connecting with them and really understanding their process more and having the one-on-one strategy coaching and the conferences, again, I have tons of information, but now I know what to do with it. And it's a huge thing to be able to go from tons of information, all the ambition and drive that you need, to actually being able to physically walk it out in a way that is effective and in a way that's really going to bring the growth and the strategy that you want. And so for brand builders, for me, has been, like I said, it's been a godsend, and it's been like the center of a cogwheel. I had all of these spokes, but I didn't have that central core piece that was really going to help me, roll forward and move forward. And so for brand builders, for me, has been phenomenal.
That phase one event is something that they run everybody through their program. I enjoyed it. There was several pieces of it that I felt like were major takeaways. Which exercise of that phase one, and for those of our audience that are listening that may not know, check out Brand Builders Group out of Nashville, Tennessee. But what was the most important exercise, if you can think back to that seminar, that conference that we were doing back in April over Zoom? What did you get the most value from?
I would say I got the most value from really nailing down my one sentence message, because I had a lot of ideas that surrounded what I wanted to speak on and what I wanted my message to be, but to really condense it down to a one sentence message was difficult, but at the same time, it was so freeing, because I was really able to start to organize my thoughts in an effective way to then describe what's my message that I want to give out to the world. And so for me, that came down to the sentence of let go of the outcome. And so that message for me meant a lot, because like I said, I had a lot of ideas about what I really want to put out in the world, but to condense that down to one sentence helped me to start to build a framework around it, which is of course a lot of what they talk about in brand builders, is building a framework. But then it also helped me bring clarity to the book that I already wrote as I'm continuing to fine tune it as it gets to publishing. That message of let go of the outcome was probably the best takeaway from that event.
It's amazing. And I've got a mentor that was a 30 under 30 for Realtor magazine in 2005. And when I saw him achieve that pinnacle of his career, and he ended up naming his company Pinnacle Real Estate Advisors, his name is Matt. Matt shared with me that one of the things that he does as a meditative practice is remind himself to detach himself from the outcome and remove himself from the outcome, because all he can control is his actions in a discussion. The outcome will be what will be. And I think that's great advice. I love it. All right. As we talk about Brand Builders Group and defining a brand, by the way, the exercise that I liked the most was creating, and they give you a template for this, creating my own bio. And I think that was wonderful. It's super helpful. That was something I was struggling to do, and it's hard to write about yourself. Let's segue into the idea of writing a book. That's something I aspire to do. And I actually got a publishing deal that I talked to Rory about. And it's just, for whatever reason, I'm reluctant to go through with it. And so for an aspiring author, you're coming on the other side of it. And there's so many people who have that goal of writing a book. Was it difficult? Was it more difficult than you expected? And really, what was your breakthrough to saying, I went from research mode to now pulling all this together as a curator of an idea?
That's a good question. I would say one of the biggest eye-openers for me is that, John Acuff addresses it in his book, Finish. I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Acuff, but he has a book called Start and Finish. And he wrote this book called Start. Yeah, he wrote this book called Start, and he found people coming up to him saying, I don't really have a problem starting, where my problem really is in finishing. And it was so funny, because when I started this book, I had so much inspiration and drive and ambition, and I got through 75%, and I really struggled with that last 25%. So I was kind of doing a lot of self-talk and reflection, why am I struggling in the last half or the last portion of this? And I realized that the motivation that you start a book or a project with may not be the motivation that you finish with. There's a point where you get as far as you get into a book and you feel like you've given all there is to give, but you have to finish it out. And that's where you really just have to dig deep and press through and continue to formulate your ideas out, knowing that when you go back for that second draft and that third draft and that, as you go back, you're going to fine tune it along the way, but pushing yourself when you feel like you have nothing left to give. So that was huge for me, realizing that the motivation you start with isn't necessarily the motivation that you end with. And then just, I guess what I would say, the start probably wasn't hard, the finish was harder. And then the other part of it is, and it speaks to my message of let go of the outcome. Sometimes we're afraid to start things because we don't know whether it's going to look like all that we've envisioned it to look like. Of course, as people who are, in what you do and what I do and your audience, they're people of excellence. They want the bestseller. They want the outcome at the end to be specific to the vision that they have. But when you learn to untie your happiness from a destination and untie your happiness from the outcome, then that brings freedom and liberation to really put out there what you feel on your heart to put out, instead of being paralyzed by, well, I don't know if it's going to be a bestseller. I don't know if it's going to reach the audience in the way I want to reach the audience. I don't know if it's going to resonate the way that I want it to. But when you untie your happiness from a specific picture, sometimes it's freeing and liberating, because then you can just put what's on your heart to produce. And if you don't mind, I'll share a quick story. When I was going through coaching with Marie Cochran of Relentless and Winning Mindset, which is where More Than Done really started, when she said, you need to write a book. And she was really the encourager for me to start. She gave me this analogy of, Dawn, you're like an apple tree, and it's your job to produce, but it's not necessarily your job to control what other people do with the fruit that you produce. So she said, some people may come take an apple off the apple tree and they make applesauce. Somebody may come take an apple and off your apple tree and they may make apple pie. If you're so concerned about what they're going to do with what you produce, then you find yourself paralyzed from even really producing content and a message in a book. And for me, that was really freeing, and it was helped me really to shift my perspective from trying too much to control how I may or may not be perceived, which is something that I can't control. I can certainly do my best, but it was holding me back from really pursuing what I wanted to pursue and putting out the message that I had. And so I felt like that analogy was really helpful in the sense of, sometimes we get so focused on the end that we don't even get started, or we get so focused on how we're perceived or how it will come across, or that end result. But really it goes back to just get started. Be willing, to have a first day, a first draft, and be willing to fail forward and move forward perfectly imperfect, because it's in that process where you find excellence. Sometimes we're, being people who are ambitious and driven, we get stuck on that end result. But if we can just choose to move forward perfectly imperfect, we'll find excellence along the way.
That's amazing. And I really like that you used the book Fail Forward or Failing Forward by John C. Maxwell. It's an old book. It's 20 years old, but I read it for the first time last year. And one of the core tenets of the book is it's not about will you fail. It's definitely a certainty that you will fail. Mm-hmm. And the thing that John C. Maxwell reminds his reader is that it's about how you handle failure. And it's also the most successful people in the world actually learn how to profit from their failures. Mm. And that's the big key, the golden thread of that book. Jon Acuff, I love Jon Acuff. So I actually got to meet John, sort of connection through Rory Vaden in Nashville, Tennessee, and a connection to a late guest of our show, Chris Oakley. We were at Sopapia's in Nashville, Tennessee. John and Jenny Acuff walked in while Chris and I were sitting there. And John and Chris used to work together at Dave Ramsey's organization. And I've been a big fan of John's, love reading his books, read Quitter, read Start. I have not read Finish yet. And, we struck up a conversation and John shared his email. I'm not going to share it with the audience here, so you can't get it. But John shared his email and we went back and forth a couple of times, and he's actually agreed to be on our show next year, which is really cool.
Oh, and awesome.
The thing that I like about Jon Acuff's work is it's funny, but he also puts things in order in such a way that really help you understand that it's about kind of working through any insecurities that you might have. And it's very similar to the work that you do. And I just really feel like when I read John's work, he's speaking to me. And he's a lot funnier than I am. And so I always chuckle as I'm reading, which is always a good thing to do too. Dawn, if you've got a couple minutes left here as we end our show, I'm going to ask you some questions that I ask every guest, and I hope you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here we go. Okay. So the question that I love to ask people comes from a song. I know your book is a faith-based book, so this is probably not going to be a surprise to you. It's a song by the band Mercy Me, and it's a song called Dear Younger Me. And for the audience that hasn't heard this song before, the idea is the writers of the song and the singers are saying, this is a letter that I'm writing to myself. And I have dubbed this is not in the song, but I've dubbed it as the advice you wish you knew when you were 22.
Mm.
And I think that your book very much communicates a lot of those messages. And I love that you shared that your audience should be writing a letter to themselves and changing their name in that letter and facing their insecurities and their fears. And so the question that I have for you, Don, is if you've got someone in the book line, you know, when we can all meet in person, you could be at Barnes and Noble or it could be at Books A Million or wherever you are, and you've got someone that's in their 20s that maybe is a real estate agent, and we'll call her Calibrate Callie, and she comes over to you and asks you to sign the book, and you're excited about that because that's something I'm sure you've envisioned for quite some time as an author. And she says, Don, what advice would you give to me? I'm in my 20s. I want to be a successful realtor. What's the advice you would give to me today? What would you say to Callie?
That's such a good question. I love reflective questions like that. What I would say to her, even to myself looking back into her, is to stress less and know that it's all going to work out. Faith over fear, trust over worry. I think so many times we get stuck in the worry and the concern over whether everything's going to work out the way that we envision it. We have a plan, we build a plan, and we go to execute that plan, and sometimes fear takes over and paralyzes. So I would say to her, stress less and trust more, fear less and bring faith in more, to know that it's going to work out, because the worry and the stress is paralyzing, and we want to move forward. It's the opposite. Worry and stress puts us in a place opposite of where we really want to be. So my best piece of advice is to stress less and really trust and have faith that it's going to work out as you move forward, as you take those actionable steps to move forward. Again, going back to like what I talk a lot about in the book is envisioning where you want to go and speaking that out, matching those thoughts with your words, and trusting that it's all going to work out in the end, which I know kind of sounds like basic advice, because sometimes we want it to be complicated. We want it to be this really complex algebraic formula. And if I just plug in all the numbers, if I just plug in all of the pieces, I'm going to get this end result. But life is rarely linear. It rarely goes from A to B to C to D. It's like you go from A to then a hard left and you're at T, and then you go over the mountain and you're at V, and then you take several steps back and you're at D again. That's just life. There's plot twists. And so regardless of the plot twists that you have had, you choose to believe that it's going to get better, and you focus more on the solution than the problem, and don't be bound back, or don't be in bondage to fear and stress. Really choose to walk out of a place of faith and trust, and that's where you're really going to start to see results. So that's what I would say my best piece of advice is.
Great answer. All right, the last question we ask all of our guests when we can is this idea of legacy. And the answer to your last question that you answered was also given by my former career coach, rest in peace, Chris Oakley. He was on episode 5 of our podcast, and he shared that when he was in his 20s, he was part of a mentoring group, sort of a men's group that was leaders and people of faith. And he was instructed to read a book called The Principle of the Path by Andy Stanley. And in that book, you're instructed to actually write your own obituary. And that became his mission statement for his career as a coach and as a business leader and influencer. And he did that for 10 or 12 years before he passed away tragically last year. And so my question for you, Don, is if you had to write your own obituary, if you had to, like the old fashioned TV commercial in the 90s, tombstone pizza, what would you want on your tombstone type of thing? What's this idea of legacy that you have that you would really want to impart onto the next generation? And what would you really want to be known for?
Wow. Good question. I guess what comes to mind initially off the cuff is wanting my legacy to be about helping people move forward in their life and no longer going from being stuck to really finding freedom and purpose in what they're meant to do. if I can help someone else through what I've been through, avoid some of those obstacles and roadblocks by helping them break through limiting beliefs and a struggling mindset, then to me, that's putting purpose to a lot of the pain that I've been through. I never like to look at mistakes or failures as something that was just a part of my life and it just stays as, some sort of obstacle that I've overcome. I want to pull from it what I can. I want to leave the pain of it behind, but I want to take the lesson. So if I can take that lesson and help somebody else, help their path be a little bit easier and find breakthrough sooner than I found it, then that's where I want my legacy. I want that for my children, and for anyone that I help along the way. I want to help them move forward and not be bound by their past or be bound by limiting beliefs that hold them back. When there's just, we all have so much potential. And if I can just help them unlock that and see them soar forward, that would be a great legacy.
I can see that happening already. And your book, #MoreThanDone, I'm sure is going to influence a lot of people and help them really work through that process. And it's a process you've naturally done yourself. It was by default, as a lot of us have, where you become this thought leader in an area because it was by necessity. You needed to do it yourself. It's what Calibrate's all about. It's all about this iterative approach. It's iteration. It's growth mindset. When I became aware of this word, calibrate, and a lot of scientists use it as a way for adjusting a machine, adjusting a tool, and saying the machine wasn't a failure. We just didn't have it adjusted the right way, and everything needs to have an adjustment or a course correction at some point. And I believe that mentors are the guide for us, and you've mentored a lot of what I like to call our Calibrate Cali today. Towne, if someone wants to pick up the book at some point here later this year, someone wants to reach out to you to be personally coached or mentored, if someone wants to find you on social, what are some of the ways that Calibrate Cali can touch base with you?
Well, actually, I have a bit of a giveaway. If you want a free chapter of the book, you can go to morethandonebook.com to receive your first free chapter before the book is released. But then you can also follow me at dontowne.com on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
All right. So that's morethandonebook.com.
Yes.
And Towne with an E at the end.
Yes.
TOWNE.com. Awesome. Towne of RE/MAX Real Estate Specialists in Iowa. Congratulations on becoming an author. I'm so excited to see that book launch happen. I know that you're going to empower a lot of women. And Christy Wright, who's the author of The Business Boutique, and their byline or their subtitle is A Woman's Guide for Making Money Doing What She Loves. She shares that a lot of men buy tickets and buy books for their loved one that's female. And so I know that you're also going to impact a lot of guys out there. I think it's a great message. I'm so excited to see #MoreThanDone come out. So for Towne, our podcast producer is Kayla Davis. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and as I love to say, we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody.